Hi, I'm Eric Court, and today I would like to go over what I hope are some high-yield pearls related to research and quality improvement to help you pick up some points on the PHM boards. First thing I would like to do is talk about a brief history of medical ethics in the United States. From 1932 to 1972, the Tuskegee trial was going on, in which individuals with syphilis were being observed to determine what the natural history of the disease was. Unfortunately, no one asked their permission to be part of this study, and they also were not informed that there was treatment available for their condition. This led to the passing of the National Research Act of 1974, which led to the writing of the Belmont Report. The Belmont Report specifies three principles for the ethical conduct of research with human subjects. That includes respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Now, one of the authors of the Belmont Report was Tom Beauchamp, and unfortunately, after the Belmont Report was released, he said, you know what, I really wish that we had categorized these principles a little bit differently. So he and his colleague James Childress wrote the Principles of Biomedical Ethics, and that book outlines four principles for the ethical conduct of human subjects research, which are autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. So pretty much any time you see a discussion of human subjects research ethics, these are usually the four principles that you will see, and these are the principles that I've seen in practice questions as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about study design and specifically study validity. So whenever you're doing any sort of research, you are selecting a sample of patients or subjects, and those patients come out of a larger population of patients or subjects that you would hope that your research is applicable to. So the first kind of validity that we think about is internal validity. And the concept of internal validity means that the conclusions of your research are an accurate representation of the subjects that you actually studied. You can't really hope to make any generalizations about the larger population until you have first drawn the correct conclusions about these individuals you actually studied. So what are some threats to internal validity? Well, number one is random error. Anytime you are taking a random sample or doing random assignment, of course, you can just get unlucky in the way that that falls out, which will introduce some skew or bias to results. In addition to random error, there are just plain old mistakes. You could make errors in recording data, you could make methodological errors, etc. Also, there are many different kinds of bias. Many kinds of bias will threaten internal validity. A typical example of that would be recall bias. And of course, you can have placebo effects. If patients think they're receiving a medication, then they might just feel better purely for psychological reasons. And finally, confounding. So confounding is a little bit more of a complicated topic, but maybe useful to be aware of. So confounding occurs when you think that you see a causal relationship between variables, but in fact that relationship appears to be there because there's a third variable that you didn't measure, which is causally related to the two variables that you did measure. So an example would be maybe you're looking at whether or not albuterol shortens length of stay in patients with bronchiolitis. And you do your study and you find out that those patients who used albuterol actually had a longer length of stay. Well, it could be the case that only the patients who looked the sickest at admission were trialed in albuterol, and of course it was a severity of illness that was related both to albuterol use and to length of stay. So if you had no analysis of severity of illness in your research study, then it would look like albuterol prolonged length of stay, but in fact that relationship is completely confounded by severity of illness. Okay, so how do we protect ourselves against these threats to internal validity? Well, the biggest one is randomization. You're not going to handpick who gets your experimental treatment and who gets placebo or who gets assigned to different groups in your study. You're going to randomize subjects where applicable to the different components of your study. Secondly, of course, is blinding. We're all familiar with the concept of a double or triple blinded placebo-controlled trial. As far as avoiding confounding, you want to be collecting sufficient data to be able to look for potential confounders, and typically we would do that through some kind of multivariate analysis. All right, so let's suppose that everything went well in your study, it was well designed, well executed, and you have drawn correct conclusions about your study population. You now would hope that your study can be generalized to a larger population of individuals. So what are threats to external validity? The biggest one would be selection bias, where somehow the participants in our study don't reflect the larger population that we would like to be able to say something about. So we want to be careful when enrolling patients that we're drawing these samples from sources that will allow us to get a representative sample of our community. Okay, next let's talk briefly about the hierarchy of quality of evidence. You've probably seen this pyramid before. And for whatever reason, I'm always tempted on these questions to say that the randomized placebo-controlled clinical trial is the best kind of evidence, but of course that's not true. Even better than that would be a systematic review. A systematic review is where you use some clearly defined strategy to identify all the published studies that relate to whatever topic you're interested in, and then you have experts review those studies and make some sort of systematic or expert synthesis of the information in those studies. Now, a meta-analysis is a subset of systematic reviews. In a meta-analysis, you're actually doing a quantitative reanalysis of the data that is presented in those studies to achieve a quantitative estimate of the true effect based on all of those studies. Okay, let's talk about sample size and power. So first of all, there are two types of errors that a study can make, aptly named type 1 and type 2 errors. A type 1 error occurs when you say that there is an effect when there isn't. So that is related to the alpha of a study. So the alpha is the probability of committing a type 1 error that you are willing to tolerate in your study, and we typically set the alpha at 0.05. So we're willing to put up with a 5% chance of making a type 1 error in our study. And this relates to the p-value of a study. So once you conduct your study and gather your data and analyze it, the p-value is essentially the probability that you have committed a type 1 error. In contrast, a type 2 error is saying that there is no effect when in fact there is an effect. And this relates to the beta of a study. So the beta is the probability of committing a type 2 error that you are willing to tolerate in your study. And a typical value would be 0.2. So typically we are willing to tolerate about a 20% chance of saying that there was no effect when actually there was. Now you can crank these values down to any value you want. You can say, well, I want my alpha and my beta to both be 0.01, so there's only a 1% chance of committing either a type 1 or a type 2 error. But as you can imagine, to get your alpha and beta that low, you would need an astronomical sample size. So with our alpha and beta in hand, what else do we need to perform a sample size calculation? Well, you need an estimate of the effect size that you want to detect. So are you interested in a decrease in length of stay of 10 minutes, or are you only interested in identifying a change in length of stay that's, say, half a day or a day long? Obviously, the smaller an effect size that you want to detect, the larger your sample size is going to have to be. Then you need some sort of estimate of central tendency, and by that we just mean an estimate of the mean or the median of the outcome that you're interested in. So you need to have some idea of what kind of length of stay you expect. So perhaps you say, well, most bronchiolitic patients are here for 3 days. And you can base that either on your own experience or on published data. And finally, you need typically some measure of variability of your data. So how variable is length of stay? If it's very variable, then you're going to need a much larger sample size to resolve any change that you're interested in. Whereas, if everybody who has bronchiolitis has a length of stay that pretty much is between 2.9 days and 3.1 days, well, then it's going to be pretty straightforward to detect a decrease of half a day. So alpha, beta, the effect size you're interested in, estimate of central tendency, the mean or the median, and then some measure of variability, usually the standard deviation or the variance. Okay, so that's how we calculate sample size. Let's talk about different types of studies. So the three kinds of studies that are most prominent would be your placebo-controlled randomized controlled trial, and then your cohort study and your case control study. So a cohort study is where you take a group of subjects or patients, and then you just look to see when your outcome of interest emerges from that group. So for example, you might have a study where you're going to enroll every RSV patient who walks through the door, and then out of that data pool, you are going to see who ends up on high-flow nasal cannula and who doesn't, and what are the differences between those patient populations. But when you enroll patients, you're not enrolling them based on whether or not they're on high-flow nasal cannula. You're just enrolling them based on whether or not they have RSV. In contrast, a case control study is where you select a group of cases and you select a group of controls. So you say, I'm going to enroll 20 patients with RSV who are not on high-flow nasal cannula and 20 patients with RSV who are on high-flow nasal cannula, and then I'm going to see what is the difference between these populations. Case control studies are particularly useful for rare phenomena because they allow for a much more efficient study. So for example, what if you were interested in patients with RSV who end up with ECMO? If you wanted to do that as a cohort study, you'd have to have a massive sample size involving many, many sites because patients with RSV hardly ever end up on ECMO. It would be much more efficient to say, I'm going to enroll 10 patients with RSV bronchiolitis who are not on ECMO and 10 patients with RSV on bronchiolitis who are on ECMO. It's still going to have to be a large multi-center trial, but at least far more manageable than doing that as a cohort study in which you'd have to have a huge group of patients in order to get your 10 who were on ECMO. Okay, finally, the moment we've all been waiting for, statistical tests. So there are two types of variables. Number one, you've got your continuous variables, and number two, you have your categorical variables. So of course, continuous variables are those that can take on any value within some sort of range of values. So an example would be systolic blood pressure. That could be anything between 0 on a bad day and maybe 250 as a absolute maximum. But between that minimum and maximum, systolic blood pressure can take on essentially any value. In contrast, a categorical variable can only take on a finite set of values, usually a quite small set of values. Examples of that would be, say, ever smoked, yes or no, or a Likert scale. How much did you enjoy your stay at the hospital? 1, totally dissatisfied, 5, loved it more than anything I can imagine. And depending on what kinds of variables you have, that will determine what kind of statistical test that you're going to do. So let's first talk about univariate tests. So these are tests where you have a single variable that you're looking at as your outcome variable and a single variable that you're looking at as your exposure variable. So what if we have two continuous variables? So maybe we are looking at length of stay, and respiratory rate when the patient was admitted. So in that case, we have two continuous variables that we can compare to each other. We would use Pearson correlation coefficient just to see if there's any correlation between those two continuous variables. In contrast, if you had one continuous variable and one categorical variable that only had two possible values, we would then use the t-test. So that would be, for example, length of stay compared to whether or not the patient ever received albuterol. So albuterol, yes, no, does that impact length of stay? Then we would use our t-test. Now, if your categorical variable can take on more than two values, then you first need to do an ANOVA or analysis of variance test to see if there is a difference between any of the groups. If that is statistically significant, then you can move on to do your pairwise t-test. So an example of that would be maybe you're interested if length of stay differs between patients with RSV versus adenovirus versus rhinoenterovirus versus influenza virus. So now you have 4 different groups you're comparing. So first you do your ANOVA, and if that's significant, then you do your pairwise t-test to see which viruses were different than each other. The next possibility is that you have 2 categorical variables. So maybe this is patient has RSV as the cause of their bronchiolitis, yes, no, and whether they needed high-flow nasal cannula, yes, no. So you have two categorical yes-no variables. You would compare those using the chi-square test. The final option I want to talk about is if you have a time variable and a categorical variable. So this is survival analysis. This would be common in, for example, cancer studies. You want to know if your new treatment increases survival. So you have survival time for every patient, and then you have whether or not they receive the new treatment, yes or no. And then we would do a survival analysis by drawing our Kaplan-Meier curves, and we would compare those curves using a log rank test. All right, so those were the univariate tests. Let's talk about the multivariate tests. So in this case, we have an outcome or effect variable, which is called a dependent variable. And we are interested if that variable is influenced by a number of different independent or predictor variables. So what if our dependent variable is continuous? So an example of this would be, again, number of days on high-flow nasal cannula, and you want to know if that is predicted by which virus the patient has, what their gestational age was, what their age today is, and what time of year it is. So you have multiple independent variables, and you want to see how those influence a continuous dependent variable. So that's just your multivariate linear regression. Now, what if your outcome variable isn't continuous, but it is categorical? So maybe you want to know whether or not a patient needs high-flow nasal cannula at all is predicted by what virus they have and what their gestational age was and what their current age is and whether or not they've ever used bronchodilators in the past, etc. Well, in this case, you would use logistic regression. So logistic regression is used when you have a dichotomous or a two-level categorical variable as your outcome of interest, and you want to know how it's predicted by any number of other variables. Finally, again, if you have survival time and you want to know how survival is influenced by any number of other variables, you would use the Cox proportional hazard regression model. So multivariate linear regression, logistic regression, and Cox proportional hazards regression. All right. Let's move on to quality improvement. So what is quality improvement? A QI project is an iterative effort to improve alignment with existing standards or policies or best practices. So if you're not sure what the existing standard should be or what best practice is, if you're trying to figure out do high-flow nasal cannula holidays decrease length of stay or not, so that you can determine whether or not high-flow nasal cannula holidays should be your policy, then that's not a QI project. That's research. Anytime you're trying to define what a best practice is or determine how effective a particular intervention is, that's research. But if you already know what the best practice is, or if you already have a policy that says what you should be doing, and you want to improve the degree to which you're actually following that best practice or complying with that policy, then that would be a QI project. And the QI methodology, of course, is the PDSA cycle. So we're going to do multiple cycles of plan, do, study, act. So let's talk about these components of the PDSA cycle. So in the plan phase of your PDSA cycle, you are going to figure out what it is you want to change, what amount of change you want to see, and how you propose to achieve that change. And there are different standard tools you can use in your plan phase to accomplish this work. The first is simply a process diagram or a flow chart. And that's a simple depiction of the different steps that are involved to get from point A to point B in any process that you're looking at. It just says what are the steps that are involved in current state, and it's a simple flow chart. The next tool that you'll encounter in QI projects is what's called a Paretto Chart. And in a Paretto chart, you look at the different factors that are influencing some outcome that you're interested in, and you are going to sort those factors from the most influential to the least influential, and then you can even draw a line of the cumulative effect size of those factors. And what this chart is allowing you to do is say, which factors should we actually look at in our PDSA cycle? So anytime you're seeing a question about how do you identify which are the most important factors that you want to work on in your project, they're talking about a Paretto chart. Next would be a cause and effect diagram or a fishbone diagram. And what this diagram does, in contrast to a flowchart, is it tries to capture all the different factors that impinge upon the process that you're interested in and influence the outcome. So these would be all of the environmental factors, the human factors, the process factors, anything that somehow has an influence over what you're trying to control and change. Then, based on your conclusions from these different kinds of analyses that we just talked about, you could develop a key driver diagram. And the key driver diagram typically has the specific aim of your project on the left. So this is what you're trying to change or achieve in your project. And then on the right, you have your secondary drivers. So these are the things that you are actually going to directly do and intervene in during your project. And in the middle are the primary drivers. So these are the people and processes that are actually determining the phenomena that you are trying to change, and these will be influenced by your secondary drivers. Now, a couple of other tools that may be incorporated into your plan phase would be a failure mode analysis. In contrast to a cause and effect diagram, a failure mode analysis is specifically asking what are the different factors that can lead to failure or an undesirable outcome. So anytime you encounter a question that's asking about how can a process fail, what are different ways that things can go wrong, how can we understand why we're not achieving the performance that we want, they're talking about a failure mode analysis. In contrast, a root cause analysis looks at why a past failure occurred. So not just how might things fail, but how did they actually fail in some past failure. Okay, so as a result of all these different ways of looking at a process and deciding what we want to make better and how we're going to make it better, it's time to design our intervention, and we want to have some sort of measures with that intervention. And there are three primary kinds of measures in a QI project. Number one, outcome measure. Number two, process measure. And number three, balancing measure. So your outcome measure is directly related to your specific aim. Exactly what is it that you are trying to change? Then you have process measures, which look at whether or not the components of your change project are actually happening. So maybe in order to ensure that patients get their high-flow nasal cannula holiday, you are going to provide some training for nursing staff, and maybe you are going to add an alert in your EMR. Well, process measures would ask how many nurses actually received the training and how often did the alert successfully fire in the EMR. So these are not your primary aims, these are steps to achieve your primary aims, and measuring whether or not these steps actually occurred would be process measures. And then finally, your balancing measures are looking at unintended outcomes. So you might be looking at things like PICU transfers or prolonged length of stay. Those would be balancing measures because you hope in the course of increasing high-flow nasal cannula, there aren't any adverse outcomes, but you want to make sure that those adverse outcomes actually don't occur. So having gone through those steps, you are now ready for the do step where you actually carry out your intervention. And after you do that and collect some data, you'll want to study your data, and typically that is done through the form of a run chart. And typically a run chart will be depicting your outcome measure, although you can also do this with your process measures and your balancing measures, but you're looking over time to see what the frequency of the events of interest are, and you hope to see that there is a shift in these frequencies as a result of your interventions. So you do your run chart and you look for shifts and for trends to decide if your intervention was successful. And then finally, the ACT phase of your PDSA cycle. During the ACT phase, you're going to say, okay, what happened in our project? Did we achieve the improvement we wanted to? If we did, are we going to disseminate these interventions more widely, or do we need to do another PDSA cycle to achieve more or different improvements? The last thing I want to talk about are quality improvement and quality assurance frameworks. So what's Six Sigma? Six Sigma is a framework for quality improvement and quality assurance. The sigma refers to variation or standard deviation. And the fundamental principle of Six Sigma is you want to keep every process at least 6 standard deviations away from failure, which would correspond to a failure rate of only a couple per million. So the core of Six Sigma is data collection, data analysis, and then tight statistical control on processes. So if you see a question talking about gathering a bunch of data about some process going on, say in the hospital, figuring out what the means and standard deviations of each step in a process are, and then imposing tight controls to constrain the variation of those steps to ensure the outcomes you're looking for, they're applying Six Sigma methodology in that case. In contrast, the lean methodology is focused on identifying and eliminating waste. And this is done through something called value stream mapping. So you're looking at each step in a process, starting with what does the customer actually want, and then how do we go through the steps to produce the good or service that the customer wants. And at every step along the way, identifying wastes in terms of time, energy, resources, movement, etc., and then eliminating those wastes to make this entire process more efficient. All right, I hope that has been useful. I hope it helps you pick up a couple of points on the board exam. If you feel that I've made any mistakes, please comment down below. If there are other topics or pieces of information you wish I had covered, please comment down below. And in the description, I'll put a link to the PowerPoint slides for this video, as well as a handout that summarizes the information we covered, and a link to a set of flashcards on Brainscape that you can use if you want to review this material. Thanks and good luck.